All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 24, The Jazz Age, Redefining the Nation, 1919 to 1929. We'll be looking at Section 1, Prosperity and the Production of Popular Entertainment. So one thing that characterized the time period of 1919 to 1929 was an increase in prosperity. A lot of this had to do with the post-war prosperity. And of course, the war that we're talking about is World War I, which was from 1914 roughly till 1919. And for most of that war, the United States remained out of the conflict, but was able to sell a lot of the war-related materials. They made a lot of loans. And so when the United States finally did join World War I in 1917, it emerged as a victorious power, really not having bore the most of the fighting or the brunt of the fighting that took place. So the U.S. is in a really good position, and this translates into increased prosperity during the 1920s. And generally speaking, the entire decade is about prosperity, the booming economy. One of the industries that really took off during the 1920s was the movie industry. The movie industry served as an escape from the real world. The movie industry in the 1920s and really later on into the 1930s, which is considered to be the golden age of the film industry, was incredibly popular. There was a movie theater built in practically every single American town. It was, on average, Americans attended a movie more than once a week. So it really became kind of a mainstay of American culture. Initially, films were silent films. The most popular movie star of the time was Charlie Chaplin. This is who you see Charlie Chaplin right here. So we'll call him the most famous movie star. But you began having talkies, or what they call talkie films. This is movies with sound. And the first movie with sound was The Jazz Singer, which I believe was in 1927. So after 1927, you began to get films that had sound in them. And then a little bit later on in the 1930s, you finally added color to that. But both of these were kind of important steps for building up the movie industry. Eventually, though, initially the movie industry was located in New York, but a lot of problems with things like weather caused the film industry to move to Hollywood, which became the center of film and movies, really not just in the US, but in the world. Hollywood was a world renowned area where the entire movie industry essentially moved to. So that became the center for this particular industry. Additionally, there were also other technological innovations coupled with the prosperity of the 1920s that fundamentally transformed American society, where films and movie theaters could serve as a new institution of entertainment. Automobiles, more importantly, in the 1920s, there are really two really important technological consumer goods. The first one is the automobile or the car, and the second one is the radio. And probably more so than anything else, those two consumer goods not only become more widely available, meaning people are buying cars, people are buying radios, but they really transform the American landscape. Now, automobiles had been invented before the 1920s. They had existed, but they were luxury items. Cars were more like toys than serving really a practical purpose. And it wasn't until Henry Ford, who is the founder of Ford Motor Company, revolutionized the way of producing automobiles, which made them available to a mass audience. The Model T especially, this was a type of car that Ford produced. It was mass produced. And with new production techniques, specifically the moving assembly line, Ford was able to take the price of the Model T, which was originally $850 and move it back down to $300, which made it incredibly affordable. And so really what we say the contributing factor of Ford, the Model T, and the assembly line. And the assembly line is a way, we'll say a way to mass produce goods for cheap, right? We'll just say that. Here's actually a picture of an assembly line. So rather than just build the car from the ground up, right? Rather than take kind of, the wheels and the seats and the glass and just kind of put them all together one by one, rather you would have cars along this moving assembly line. And at each station, one person would perform one task. And so one person would put in the seats and then the car itself would move to the next kind of task, whatever needed to be required. And they would put on the lights or they would put on the tire. And this was a much quicker way of producing things. It was a much more efficient way of producing things. And again, it made things much, much, much cheaper. And so Henry Ford, the Model T and the assembly line, again, not the inventor of the car, but sometimes we say he democratized it. He made it available to a wide range of Americans. And during the 1920s, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 American families came to own an automobile. Now for the workers, it was, working on these assembly lines was very, very repetitive. Again, you would be performing the same task over and over and over again. But Ford was willing to pay his workers more than the wages of the day. In fact, more than double of what most automobile workers made. And that was in part to prevent workers from striking, but also he wanted his workers to be able to afford the product that was available. So very repetitive tasks on the assembly line, but Henry Ford himself offered better pay. Now, the automobile had a huge impact, not just on itself, but other industries, and it led to really an economic boom of sorts, right? All industries associated with the automobile really thrived in the 1920s. The glass industry, the steel industry, the rubber industry, public roads allowed for more urban sprawl, right? So now cities could spread out even further than really they'd ever had before. Before you'd had urban sprawl, but that was done mainly by mass transportation networks. Remember, we talked about subways, trains, those were ways of getting people around, but automobiles, now you could go where the trains don't go. You could go where the subways don't go. And this was very important in terms of really kind of instilling a sense of, physical freedom, right? And that's really what the car represented. The automobile represented individualism. It represented freedom, the ability to just go in your car whenever and go wherever you want. That was never possible before, right? That was never possible before. To a lesser extent, airplanes also became more widely available. Airplanes, which had been invented in the early 1900s, certainly had their limitations, but a major milestone in aviation accomplishment happened when Charles Lindbergh sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. So he sailed, what am I saying? Flew. You don't sail in a plane. Flew from New York to Paris, right? Nonstop. And that was considered a huge technological accomplishment. The Spirit of St. Louis is the plane, the name of the plane. Lindbergh flew. There's a picture of Lindbergh right here with the Spirit of St. Louis. And, because of such accomplishments and technological advancements, you did have passenger air transport that began to take root in the 1920s and 1930s. This would be something like commercial airlines. Now, technological advancement also led to other consumer goods. We'll talk about the radio more here in a second. Vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, generally making household upkeep easier, right? This was, all these things together we'd say is an increase in the standard of living. And that certainly was the case in the 1920s. The standard of living definitely increased, maybe more so than any other time in all of American history. And the way that some of these items became more available was through different ways of paying for them. So credit and installment plans were both made available for American consumers. Credit, of course, is buy now, pay later, if you're familiar with credit cards, maybe not. Installment plans allow you to divide up payments So for example, you could buy, using credit and installment plans, you could actually buy a Model T, I think for only $25 down, right? You only had to have $25 in your pocket, and you could essentially get a brand new car, given you do have to pay the whole car back eventually, but pay later and divide it up into different areas. And one sort of indicator of this really abundance of material goods is the increase in advertising. So advertising really shows us two things. It's an indication of material surplus, right? Anytime you see more advertising, right? So here's an advertisement from the 20s. It's generally an indication that more material goods are available. The supply is more than the demand, and so you need to really create more demand. And the second thing is that advertising increased in the 1920s. And advertisers really got a lot more creative in the way that they pushed various products out. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about in this chapter is the radio, because the radio also had a very sort of transformative effect on American society, like the automobile. Radios were used for advertising products, entertainment, and sports. Much like Charlie Chaplin was the first movie star in American history, because of the radio and the national reach. Remember, you could listen to the radio pretty much anywhere in the country. You had somewhat, or what some might consider the first sports star, which was Babe Ruth. And of course, sports stars sort of reached that celebrity status. The radio also helped create a certain nationalization, that is to bring the country together. Because recall that everybody, north, south, east, west, urban, and rural, thanks to the radio, are listening to the same programs. They have a stronger sense of what it means to be American. At the same time, and let's see if I can pronounce this, homogeneism, right? I think I said that right, is creating a more uniform / less diverse culture, right? So now you had something that was more of an American culture rather than a northern culture or a southern culture or a rural culture or a urban culture, right? That especially for a lot of the new immigrants that came during the Gilded Age, their sons and daughters, gave up a lot of the cultural attributes that came from the motherland and assimilated themselves more so in American society. And that feeling of being an American and being part of American culture, radio was an incredibly powerful tool in really tying the nation together.